What is going on, everyone? James Hancock here. I'm back for another one of my top 10 videos, and today I'm going to be tackling my top 10 favorite stories featuring one of the most memorable villains in all of pop culture, Darkseid. Created by the king of comics, Jack Kirby, back in 1970, this omnipotent despot, Darkseid, has been terrorizing the DC universe for the last 50 years, and with the Snyder cut of the Justice League heading our way next year, Darkseid is coming. Or as Grant Morrison famously wrote back in his Rock of Ages storyline, Darkseid is. And to help people appreciate this moment in pop culture history, I've assembled a list of my top 10 favorite Darkseid stories, both in comics as well as in animation, the two mediums where he's been featured most prominently. Admittedly, he's popped up in live action before in shows like Smallville, and he's appeared in tons of video games going all the way back to 1985. And along those lines, my favorite Darkseid moment in video games has to be his truly epic super move in the 2017 game Injustice 2, where we see his dark might fully on display. But that's the only game I've ever played featuring the character of Darkseid, so I'm going to restrict my focus and concentration to animation and comics, where my knowledge of the character is much more extensive. But before I get into my list, let's go over some basics for the uninitiated. Darkseid's one of the new gods and the ruler of APOKOLIPS, a nightmarish planet that's the mirror image to New Genesis, a planet with which Darkseid is locked in eternal struggle. The most famous ceasefire between the two planets came about when Darkseid and the Highfather, the ruler of New Genesis, formed this pact by swapping their sons to be raised by their most hated enemy. The Highfather's son would grow up to become Mr. Miracle, while Darkseid's son would grow up to be Orion, a being that many believe is the only person who can kill Darkseid for good. Darkseid is one of the most powerful beings in all the DC universe, can easily go toe-to-toe with someone like Superman, and often does. But what makes Darkseid so fun to look at in combat is seeing his Omega beams in action as they fly through the air with this signature Aztec zigzags before they inevitably find their target. Depending upon which writers and artists are in the driver's seat, Darkseid's been depicted in a variety of ways. Sometimes he's a hulking dictator, just trying to grind the universe into submission, and other times he's depicted as a mythic force of the universe who exists on a dimension that can barely be conceived by human beings. But the one constant in all these depictions of Darkseid is this perpetual quest to find the anti-life equation, which will essentially grant him control over the minds of all living things, robbing them of their free will, basically making all of reality an extension of Darkseid. As the saying goes, Darkseid is. What's remarkable to me, though, is that after 50 years, Jack Kirby's Fourth World and the New Gods remain one of the richest and most mysterious corners of the DC universe. Kirby's creation is so original and iconic that very rarely does a writer even dare to change or add to Kirby's grand mythos. Typically, these writers and artists just enjoy their time in Kirby's sandbox playing with his toys. And I think the reason Kirby's creation has endured is because of the many abstract and metaphysical concepts that he introduced, like the source and the anti-life equation. These concepts lend the characters to a variety of interpretations where maniacs like Grant Morrison can just let their imaginations run wild. And Kirby's character designs were so bonkers and insane that the look of the characters have remained fundamentally unchanged for half a century, something unheard of in comics. I think one of the greatest achievements for any storyteller in any field is when an author or an artist or a filmmaker is able to build a world that continues to attract new storytellers long after the original creator is gone. Examples like Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, or H.P. Lovecraft and his Elder Gods, Ian Fleming and James Bond, Stan Lee in the Marvel Universe. Jack Kirby obviously played an essential role in building the Marvel Universe as well, but the New Gods are his creation alone, where across 4 titles with 55 issues, he wrote and drew his Wagnerian Saga. And years before George Lucas gave us the Force, Jack Kirby, he gave us the Source. At least he did until these books were prematurely canceled, or at least postponed for many years, until he was finally invited back to try and wrap up his story. But I think I've yammered enough at this point. It's time to dig into some of these stories. And I should mention that a lot of these stories started out as comics, but then were adapted so faithfully as animation that the easiest solution is just to discuss the comic as well as the animated adaptation at the same time. But for my number 10, let's start with one of the earliest examples of a classic Darkseid storyline where Jack Kirby was not involved. We have The Great Darkness Saga. This is a 5-issue arc from 1982 starring the Legion of Superheroes, specifically issues 290 to 294. And I wish I could claim to have read it when it was first published, but I discovered the trade paperback collecting the story many years later in my early 20s. But it was written by Paul Levitz with art by Keith Giffen and Larry Malstedt, if I'm saying that correctly. But what's great about the story is seeing Darkseid make his return many centuries after he's been defeated and forgotten. But I should add that this was not the first appearance by Darkseid without the participation of Jack Kirby. That honor belongs to Justice League of America 183 to 185. But for me, it's the Great Darkness Saga, which proved that Darkseid would continue to endure as an iconic villain as long long as he was placed in the hands of storytellers who understand what makes him tick. And for my number 9, we have a 6-issue limited series that I did read in real time back in the day, Legends from 1986 to 1987. The series was plotted by John Ostrander, scripted by Len Wein, and penciled by one of my all-time favorite childhood comic book artists, John Byrne. And the story is vintage Darkseid. It's all about him turning humanity against superheroes, killing their need and desire for legends, making Earth all the more vulnerable to invasion. What makes the story so timeless is the character Glorious Godfrey, who's sent by Darkseid to poison and influence the minds of the people, a common theme in stories by Darkseid. He doesn't simply destroy and conquer, he robs people of their ability to think for themselves, something far more terrifying. At any rate, fans of the Suicide Squad will love how they're put to use in this story, but more importantly for me, it introduced a brand new lineup for the Justice League, leading straight into my favorite era in the history of the title. But let's push on to number 8, where we have Justice League War, 2014 animated movie, adapted from Jeff Johns' comic book reboot of Justice League during the 2011 launch of the New 52, although this film does have some minor changes to the lineup of the team. And while I might not be a fan of how frequently DC likes to do company-wide reboots, I'm a sucker for any title drawn by Jim Lee, and a lot of people have justifiably pushed back on the way some of the characters are portrayed in this story, and I share their frustrations, but both on the page as well as on the screen, this story gives us some fantastic moments, like when Darkseid crushes Green Lantern's arm, or when Wonder Woman shoves a sword right into Darkseid's face. What I like about Darkseid's fighting style is that he never really bothers to move unless he has to. He'd rather float in a standing position and fry people with his Omega beams, but you can tell when he's taking a threat seriously once he actually starts using his arms and legs. In any event, Jeff Johns unfortunately tends to write Darkseid as a bit of a simplistic one-note destructive force, but this tale remains a lot of fun from start to finish. But while we're on the subject of Jeff Johns, let's continue with my number 7, The Darkseid War, which started in 2015 with Justice League Volume 2 number 40 and continued up through number 50, and the launch of yet another company-wide reboot, DC Rebirth. That was about the time that I threw up my hands in frustration, and it was one of the many reasons that I stopped buying as many comics from DC. But this story, The Darkseid War, which I recently reread, it absolutely kicks ass. What's cool is that the story actually addresses how the DC universe gets reset so frequently, and that reality is starting to fall apart as a result. But what really sells it for me is the art by Jason Fabok and Francis Manapul, both of whom get to draw a few issues each. And I should add that they also both make Darkseid's evil daughter one of the sexiest comic book villains of the last 10 years. My one knock against this story is that it's not a particularly good story when it comes to great scenes featuring Darkseid, but what's interesting is what happens to the Justice League in a universe without Darkseid, as the universe struggles to fill the vacuum of his absence by converting key members of the Justice League into gods themselves. Batman becomes the god of knowledge, Lex Luthor becomes the god of apocalypse, Superman the god of strength, Flash the god of death. It's absolutely phenomenal stuff, and a strong contender for my favorite story ever written by Jeff Johns. So for number 6, we have another story where the animated movie and the story it's based on are so similar that I'm tackling them simultaneously. But I'm a big fan of the 2010 animated movie Superman/Batman Apocalypse, based on the 2004 arc written by Jeff Loeb and drawn by Michael Turner back in Superman Batman issues 8 to 13. I've never been the biggest fan of artist Michael Turner's overemphasis on cheekbones. However, I thoroughly enjoyed this story, which tells the tale of the arrival of Supergirl and how everyone from Superman to Wonder Woman to Darkseid himself, who's voiced by Andre Bauer, they all try to guide her into figuring out who she wants to be. And the animated movie features a sequence that's far better than in the original comic, when Wonder Woman, Big Barda, and the Furies that she once led had this knockdown, drag-out brawl, all while Superman's getting his ass kicked by Supergirl under the tutelage of Darkseid. And while it's not the climax of the story, the emotional peak for me is this classic moment where Darkseid has to admit that he's impressed by Batman's cunning as well as his resourcefulness. And while I might prefer that the way this tale ends in the comic versus the movie, you really can't go wrong with either. But now we're moving on to my top 5, starting with the very first story that I ever encountered featuring this lovable tyrant. I loved it at the age of 6, and I love it even more now, but we have Marvel and DC present featuring the Uncanny X-Men and the New Teen Titans from 1982. This classic tale is one of my all-time favorite standalone comics, but it's not part of any regular continuity. No explanation is given or needed. It's just a hybrid between DC and Marvel, one written by the great Chris Claremont and illustrated by one of the great titans of comic book art, Walt Simonson. Not only is Simonson one of the best artists to take enormous amounts of inspiration from Kirby's style, but he's responsible for contributing the most important ingredient of the New Gods mythology that wasn't completely fleshed out already by Kirby himself, the Source Wall. Back in the early 70s, Jack Kirby introduced the idea of these Promethean giants who were imprisoned after trying and failing to understand the source. But with this comic, Simonson gave us the classic appearance of the source wall, where deities are imprisoned after trying to grasp that which cannot be grasped. And it kills me that the story wasn't fleshed out into a proper series, but we have to enjoy what we have. And these two teams, they mesh together so organically, but more importantly, we get scenes like Wolverine versus Deathstroke, or even better, Scott Summers temporarily imbued with the power of Phoenix, frying Darkseid where he stands. Comic book fans love the debate which is better, Marvel or DC, but after reading this comic, you'll come to the only logical conclusion: the answer is both. And for my number 4, we have a film that I think is one of the better movies of 2020. I know that's not saying much because so few movies have come out this year. Nonetheless, Justice League Dark Apocalypse War is one of the best animated movies ever set in the DC universe. There's a problem in comics and in animation that every great supervillain inevitably faces, where once they've been defeated a certain number of times, they lose their ability to be perceived as a credible threat. Well, this film does the opposite, where it shows us precisely what would happen if the Justice League launched an attack on Apokolips and failed. Darkseid, voiced by actor Tony Todd, has his way with the Justice League, ripping them limb from limb, leaving them either crippled or enslaved as his new lieutenants. And 2 years later, we're presented with this dystopian vision of the world that I absolutely adored, where the remnants of Earth's heroes, alongside Earth's deadliest villains, have to band together to take down Darkseid and try and restore the natural order of the universe. Quite literally, in that this apocalyptic story resets the current continuity of the DC animated universe that had been in place since the end of the Flashpoint paradox in 2013, followed by Justice League War, which I discussed earlier. And typically superhero stories inevitably veer toward restoring the status quo, but in this tale, all bets are off. Fan favorite heroes like Nightwing and Batgirl get hacked down indiscriminately. Icons like Batman and Wonder Woman are reinvented as the embodiment of evil. And Darkseid takes out the entire Green Lantern Corps when he destroys Oa by dumping part of the Earth's core right on top of it. It's just insane. But best of all is seeing the ultimate old god versus new god smackdown when Trigon possesses a crippled, powerless Clark Kent in order to take on Darkseid in single combat. The DC animated movie universe doesn't get any better than this. But it's time to get serious with my top 3. And my number 3 is one that just as easily could have taken the top slot, but I have Final Crisis written by my favorite mad prophet, Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison's my favorite living writer in the world of comics, and if he started a religion, I'd probably join it. And we got our first taste of what he would do with Darkseid back in 1997 and 1998 with his legendary Rock of Ages storyline, which ran from JLA number 10 through JLA number 15, where for a few issues, the Justice League explored this bleak future where Darkseid had already taken over the Earth. And I've read that arc more times than I can count, but that was only a rough draft compared to what Morrison would eventually accomplish with Final Crisis, which began in the summer of 2008. The story takes place after Darkseid and his minions have finally won their endless war against New Genesis. It was basically a battle in the heavens, and evil won. And the survivors, including Darkseid, have fallen out of their dimension and are gradually being reborn on Earth, where Darkseid proceeds to enslave humanity with the anti-life equation. That is until Batman and Darkseid have an epic face-off. But Final Crisis, it's grim, it's genuinely mythic, and at times borderline incomprehensible, in part because Grant Morrison's experimenting with a lot of metaphysical concepts, but also because the series is tough to read without all the various tie-ins that flesh out the story. But here's a quick look at Morrison's essential reading order. And part of me feels like this story's incomplete and flawed, and that has a lot to do with the fact that artist J.G. Jones didn't get to stick with the series all the way to the end. That said, the series has scenes and moments and panels that are some of my all-time favorites in the history of comics. For me, this is Darkseid's peak as a threat to the entire universe, to reality itself, where all of its strange potential is the ultimate authoritarian nightmare, which had been hinted at for decades. It was finally explored to the fullest, and one of many examples of why Grant Morrison is my favorite living writer in the world of comics. Now, for my next story, you have to watch not one, not two, but 3 different television shows. But for my number 2, I'm going to go with what I call the Michael Ironside era. Michael Ironside, he's a legend with so many incredible roles in Scanners and Total Recall, Starship Troopers, but he was put on this earth to play Darkseid. He has the best voice by far of any actor who's ever played the character, and if you put together all of his appearances from Superman the Animated Series, Justice League, and Justice League Unlimited, what you're left with is something that might be the most satisfying Darkseid story we will ever see on the screen. And what I love is how Darkseid is always flip-flopping between wanting to recruit Superman to be his greatest champion to wanting to tear out his heart with his own hands. And across these 3 shows, they have so many kick-ass slugfests, but my favorite moment has to be when Darkseid recruits Superman to fight Brainiac on Apokolips, which turns out to be a double-cross, which turns out to be yet another double-cross. It's vintage Darkseid, because people have to remember that in addition to being a force of nature, he's also this diabolical plotter and schemer with plans within plans. And he also gets to bitch-slap Superman quite a few times. Ultimately, Supes gets some major payback in the final episode of Justice League Unlimited, written by the great Dwayne McDuffie, and easily one of my favorite episodes of any show ever, where Superman finally gets to cut loose on Darkseid in ways that remind us just how powerful Superman truly is. But in the end, it's up to Lex Luthor and his adventure beyond the Source Wall that provides the key to taking down Darkseid in an incredibly satisfying series finale. And not only was it a satisfying series finale, it marked the end of an animated story that had begun way back in the early 90s with Batman the Animated Series. So for fans of Bruce Timm, his animation style, his producing style, this entire series gets my highest possible recommendation. And at last we come to my number one, and it's been obvious all along, but we have Jack Kirby's Fourth World Saga, collected in this 4-part omnibus collection, which I have proudly displayed in all my videos. But for me, Jack Kirby's work from the early 70s is the strongest work of his career. Kirby would return to these characters a decade later with stories like Superpowers, which I read as a kid, which also spawned a line of action figures that I obsessed over after seeing their commercials on TV, which might be the first appearance of Darkseid on the screen, but I'll need to check to confirm. But for my money, Jack Kirby's efforts with these characters in the 80s pale in comparison to the intoxicating hallucinatory pleasure of reading comics like New Gods #7, which is my favorite issue ever written or drawn by Jack Kirby. And at times these issues of New Gods and Forever People, they can feel a little bit all over the place, almost as if Jack Kirby's reach might exceed his grasp. Or perhaps he was just cranking out too many books by himself. But with New Gods #7, Jack Kirby slowed down and gave us a story as compelling as anything you might find in Greek mythology or Norse mythology, where he lays out the entire groundwork for this entire tapestry of stories with a story called The Pact. And I'm not alone in my enthusiasm. In the intro for the omnibus, which you see over my shoulder, Grant Morrison writes, "With its themes of warring ideologies, its solidarity with the eternal spirit of youth and freedom, its message of hope and consciousness evolution, the Fourth World Saga retains an urgent freshness and contemporary relevance. Its outrageous images still resonate, its characters still burst like fireworks from the pages, spitting Shakespearean jive and the battle cries of bloody revelation. Its lack of conclusion invites speculation and participation. Many writers and artists, including myself, have tried to add our own touches to the mythology in the years since the Fourth World books ceased publication, learning all we can from our clumsy attempts to dance a while with the king and his court of celestials and diabolicals, his ordinary men and women tangled up in the intrigues of titanic forces beyond their understanding. It's a big, generous work that demands rereading and rewards with a joyous torrent of ideas and possibilities." Now, there is no possible way that I could say anything that's going to top what Grant Morrison just wrote about this masterpiece. So I'm going to start wrapping this up, but I do want to include a few honorable mentions. It hurts me not to include Orion by Walt Simonson. I would have loved to have included the animated film Reign of the Supermen, where Darkseid makes a really cool appearance. And his appearance in Season 3 of Young Justice was insanely cool as well. And if you want to keep things more innocent, you can always revisit his 1984 animated appearance where he went up against the Super Friends. But along the way, if I failed to mention any of your favorites, I urge you to include them in the comments below, or better still, crank out your own top 10 list and spread the word about what a cool character this is. But looking ahead, my hope is that Warner Brothers realizes what an asset they have on their hands. The cautionary tale of Darkseid and his obsession with the anti-life equation has applicability in any era and in any context. And when you see on the page some of the things that Darkseid and his minions are saying or doing, my hope is that it will send an evil shudder up your spine, because the ideology of Darkseid is something that sadly we're going to have to wrestle with probably for the rest of eternity. But when it comes to the Snyder Cut, I'm going to be rooting hard for Zack Snyder to deliver something special next year on HBO Max when we finally get to see his interpretation of the character. But I think that's all I got to say for now, so I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, perhaps sharing the video, and if you want to talk more about comics or Darkseid or whatever, you can always find me on Twitter at KIRBY'S. But I can't thank you enough for watching this video. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.